Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and the other day I found a great question from one of you guys that I thought would work well for a somewhat forgotten segment here on the channel, the Ask Swanky Cat segment, where I simply answer your questions. Today's question comes from a video where I was talking about some issues that I was having with both the DR650 and the Husqvarna 701 Enduro, and I'd also mentioned my Honda XR650L a bit. So with those three bikes in mind, Aaron Wade Rides 7209 here asked, out of the three bikes, because the TW is not included, what bike is the lightest bike to ride and move around? And Aaron's actually got his own channel here on YouTube, and he's currently on a rather large motorcycle, a Super Tenere. He also does some e-bike content as well. And while I've never owned a Super Tenere or even pushed one around, I can tell you that back when I owned the Tenere 700, it really was, well, kind of a hefty bike to even just get spun around and pushed out of the garage. Of course, I did ride that bike to, well, my limits anyways on some single track. It's certainly a bike that once you get it moving, you can basically do, well, just about as much as your skill level will let you. It's a very confidence-inspiring, well-set-up bike for off-road riding. But the thing is, most top-heavy bikes and most just heavy bikes in general, I suppose, are, well, a little bit of a pain in the butt to move around if you have to do it sort of under your own power, or even if you're sort of muscling the bike through some, well, less than ideal terrain for the bike's intended purpose. And to be honest, that probably was the biggest non-YouTube related reason that I decided to part ways with my Tenere 700. It was really also the reason that I decided to trade my Gen 3 KLR650 for the much lighter DR650 that we'll be talking about in a bit here today, and it's exactly why I purchased the Honda XR650L even before that. The 701 Enduro I purchased more for its horsepower to weight ratio, but as you'll see in a bit here, it's also quite a light bike. And if you guys have been watching any of the videos this last season where I've been riding these somewhat big bikes, albeit not nearly as big as a Super Tenere or even a regular Tenere 700, you know that we've just been having an absolute blast on a lot of the same trails that I rode the Tenere 700 and KLRs down. I also had, well, really a pretty good time testing them out on some trails that I was never nearly brave enough to take bikes like the Tenere 700 or either of my KLRs on. And not that it should be a huge surprise to anyone, myself included, but I am finding that these lighter bikes are just so much more fun and so much easier and much more playful to ride, both on and off the road. But before I answer Aaron's question, I want to take a quick look at the weights of each of these three bikes on my motorcycle spec spreadsheet. So my 2016 Husqvarna 701 Enduro is the lightest of the three at just 344 pounds. The Honda XR650L here is 346 pounds. And finally, the mighty heavy DR650 here weighs in at 366 pounds. And keep in mind, these are all claimed wet weights from the manufacturer, meaning that, well, there may be some real-life variability to them, and if you guys are unfamiliar, the wet weight or the curb weight just means that it has all of its essential fluids for running and driving, so everything from brake fluid to antifreeze if it's a liquid-cooled bike, to engine oil, and of course a full tank of gas. And while it might be easy to dismiss any of those fluids as really adding a whole lot of weight, especially if you're talking about a bike like a KLR650 that holds 6 gallons of fuel, in contrast to all of these three that only hold anywhere from around 3 to 4 gallons, it really can make a pretty big difference. Of course, it doesn't account for all of the weight difference between, say, a bike like the DR650 that weighs around 366 and a KLR 650 that weighs somewhere around 460 now in its third generation. But 3 or so extra gallons of gas definitely does add some weight. But what I'm finding with this latest batch of big bore dual sports that I've got in the garage is that it doesn't matter so much how they weigh, but it's where that weight is carried or where the center of gravity falls on the motorcycle. And you guys that have been following the XR650L build series probably know exactly what I'm talking about. When I purchased the XR, it had a slightly lowered seat on it, but at 5'10 and about 350 pounds with a 31-inch inseam, the 36-ish or so inch seat height that bike had when I got a hold of it was, well, a little bit much to manage. Much like the Tenere 700, of course, it was fine when I was moving, but as soon as you slow down, especially with the gripper seat, it's a little bit hard to slide over and get your foot to the ground. And I suppose I'm sort of spoiling that part of it, but what I noticed after I had that bike for a while and then traded my Gen 3 KLR for the DR650 is that the DR just seemed to handle so much better, not only on-road, but honestly off-road too. And when I say off-road, I don't mean on a motocross track. Of course, especially a much better rider than me on a motocross track, would be much, much better off with an XR650. And I'm finding that the suspension really is very, very good on the XR, where it's, well, really not very good for what I want my bikes to do on the DR650. After I realized that I liked how the DR650 handled, again, just about every single terrain that I ever planned on taking it on, it really seemed like it made a lot of sense to maybe lower the XR650 to get it a little bit closer to, well, the same center of gravity and the same height off of the ground as the DR650. And honestly, it was really just kind of going to be a bonus that I'd be able to touch the ground a little bit easier, since, as I've mentioned, I've already ridden plenty of big, heavy bikes that really had no business in any of the trails that I was taking them on. I've just learned to make do and to sort of get my leg to the ground wherever I need to, and sort of purposefully plan on where I might possibly have to do that. It's of course not the safest thing, but you certainly can get the job done. And as you guys might remember, Honda does leave a little bit of room on the triple tree clamps to drop it about 3/4 of an inch in the front, and then I use the Hemisphere off-road lowering link to drop the back of the bike about an inch. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are exactly how I used to be, and you're thinking, why would you ever lower a dual sport motorcycle? But the thing is, the Honda is set up much more like a motocross bike. It had over 13 inches of ground clearance when I first got it, and now that I've lowered an inch, it still has over a foot of ground clearance, which is about an inch or so more than what the DR650 has. So I really sacrificed very little and gained a lot. That being said, the Honda still feels a bit more top heavy than the DR650. If you guys have watched any of the off-road comparison videos, you've probably heard me say that. You may have also heard me and my dad both say how much better that bike feels, how much nicer it is to ride.
Yeah, it seems a lot less radical for some reason now. I can't believe an inch of height would make that much difference, but it seems a lot more like the DR now, actually.
Yep, that is exactly what I said and what I thought too.
Really, just even moving the bike around in the garage is much, much nicer. I still really probably would rather move the DR650 around just because it has the nice grab handles on the back, where the XR has, well, the signal lights to hold on to. But to answer Aaron's question, out of those two bikes, I would say that the DR650 is still, well, a bit lighter feeling. Not lighter, of course, because as we saw in the spreadsheet, it actually weighs a whole 20 pounds more than the XR650 does. But I think partially just because the engine, which is more or less one of the heaviest parts of the bike, is, well, at least an inch, if not more, closer to the ground. And I think maybe just the way the rest of the bike is set up, it's just, well, closer to the ground. So regardless of how much weight it has, that lower weight just has a lot less mechanical advantage on the bike and your muscles, which I've also sort of found seems like it actually transfers to the tires as well. Again, the further away the center of gravity is from your contact point on the ground, the less mechanical advantage it has on, well, your tires, the ground, whatever type of terrain you're riding through. All that being said, I think it is important to mention that we did find when we tested the XR and the DR on the Knobby Ridge single track that the XR definitely seemed to have the upper hand, and I think that that's mostly due to the sort of motocross geometry that it has. The steering is just a little bit quicker and allows you to, well, just maneuver through tight trails a little bit better. And of course, the XR's superior suspension may have played a role in that as well. So to be honest, as long as I'm on a smooth section and the DR's sort of sloppy suspension doesn't come into play, that bike really feels a lot more stuck to the ground and a lot more planted than the XR does, and I feel, well, a bit more confident on it. The other thing that sort of got me a little bit more excited about lowering the XR was the fact that the 701 Enduro, when I purchased it, had been already lowered by its previous owner. I think it was lowered somewhere between 2 and 2.5 inches, and that was done at a professional suspension shop, so the front actually has different springs in it, as does the back. So of course I never rode that bike when it was in its stock configuration, but from the experience that I've had riding the XR in its original configuration versus now in its lowered configuration, I can definitely tell you that I think it must feel a lot better than it did at one point. Maybe it wasn't quite the same as the XR was, and of course it got dropped a lot more, but the 701 Enduro has always felt nothing but absolutely solid on any terrain that I've taken it on, and I think a lot of that has to do with the lower center of gravity, of course, but I think the reason that I mentioned that the DR650 maybe doesn't feel so stuck to the ground when you're in bumpy terrain is just because the suspension just really isn't set up for fast riding. It's just kind of mushy, and if you like that about your DR650 and you prefer a sort of soft, cushy ride, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but for my personal preference, it's just not really what I like. So with those two as they sit now, the DR650 with its stock suspension and the 701 Enduro with its professionally lowered suspension, I would say that they maybe don't feel a whole lot different if you're on smooth terrain or just moving them around in the garage, but the 701 Enduro just feels vastly superior out on any rough terrain. It just keeps traction so much better. It can be easy to think that suspension is only important when you're riding really rough, bumpy terrain and going over jumps, so you're not bottoming it out. And while that is, of course, incredibly important, what I'm referring to is suspension's most basic purpose, and that is to keep your tires on the ground, because anytime you lose traction for whatever reason, you're not connected to the ground anymore, and it can become a lot easier to lose the front end or break traction in the rear and low side or high side. So having your tires connected to the ground is incredibly important, and I think is a big reason that I would say the 701 Enduro is probably the best feeling bike. I suppose I'd have to get a tape measure out to check for sure, but I believe the 701 Enduro being lowered that much is a little bit closer to the ground, meaning a little bit less ground clearance, and meaning the center of gravity is a little bit lower than the DR650. But I'm wondering if when I upgrade the suspension on the DR650, and if you guys haven't heard, I believe I've got some suspension lined up to test next spring that I'm really pretty excited about. But once that's done, I think it'll be really interesting to see how those two bikes compare both on and off the road. So if you guys want to make sure you see those videos, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you guys watching along each week. Until next time, guys, take care, stay safe, stay swanky, get out, enjoy this beautiful world that God created any chance you get. If you can't do that right now, here's some more videos to check out in the meantime. And if you've got a question that you think could be good for this segment, don't be afraid to leave it down in the comments. We'll catch you guys on the next one.